Hello. The history of life on Earth is so enormously vast that we're never going to run out of new things. And that's a really good thing for anyone who's interested in it, because it means it's incredibly easy to find something new if you know what you're looking for and you have the right eyes. So today I'm going to show you something that we turned up a couple of weeks back, and which is a completely new little story from the history of life on Earth. We're going to have to start today with nautiloids. This wonderful shell, it's a lovely thing, belonged to the pearly nautilus, which is still swimming around in the modern oceans, and belongs to a squid-like animal, with tentacles and all the rest of it. And obviously you can't tell much from a shell like that, and it looks a bit like a snail, but luckily we do have a live one here as well, which Lucy found in a knitting basket, but it's quite amenable. It seems to quite like living in the house here. And it's got these quite cute little tentacles at the front and a little hood over the top. Great big eyes. Doesn't seem to have any eyeballs. Not quite sure why. But anyway, they're very cute little pets. Especially the sort of air-breathing ones that you get around here. But the ancestors of Nautilus, of nautiloids in general, didn't quite look like this. Their shells were uncoiled. They were straight. And these are very common fossils in the Paleozoic especially. So Ordovician, Silurian, you tend to get quite a lot of fossils that look rather like this. This is not a brilliantly preserved one. It's a fragment of it. It gets wider to this end, tapers there. Some of these got up to several meters long. So they could be quite large animals, more or less equivalent to the larger squids that we have today. For anyone who thinks this is familiar, this is actually the nautiloid that has a little spirorbid worm tube. So yes, it is indeed familiar. Go and watch that video if you haven't seen it. Quite interesting things. Those spirorbids are the impressions of shells that were stuck onto the fossil. So you see this, it's been flattened obviously, but you can still see that is concave going downwards. And then the impressions of the tube worms, the things that were living on it, are impressed into the surrounding rock. So they were standing out from the surface of this originally concave shell, as you'd expect for something attached to it. No problem at all there. However, this one we want to show you today is a bit different. So here we have another fragment of a nautiloid. It's not much of one, it's quite a small piece, but it's got the same sort of shape. It's part of a cylinder that's been flattened into the rock. And you look at it this end on, you can see it's definitely got that same sort of concave shape. So the outer surface, the shell is dissolved away, the outer surface of the shell is impressed into the rock there. So anything like a tube that was stuck to the outside of the shell is going to be an impression into the rock. This, however, is a little different. You can see that there are lots of little raised lumps all over this surface. In order to be preserved as lumps on the external mould, that means that these things weren't sticking up from the shell like tube worms were. They were actually etched into it. These are depressions in the surface of the shell which have been bored into the surface. The shape of these is interesting as well, because they're quite consistent. They're not just lumps. These are elongated, and they go from a wide rounded end on the left in these images towards a narrower tapered end to the right. And this is consistent across this wide band across the middle of the shell, and also another band towards the end. We see the same shapes. Now, boring into a hard surface like a shell actually isn't that easy. There's not many groups that can do it effectively. Among the best are sponges, and some bryozoans can etch into these calcitic surfaces, but neither of those make marks that look anything like what we're seeing here. This looks like the impression of a worm, and there's actually only one group of worms, really, that can do this sort of boring, and that is the sipunculans. They're still doing it today. In fact, we found some examples of this on the west coast of Ireland. We have shells in mudstone which have been etched by these living sipunculans, or peanut worms. In these cases, they've actually etched into the surrounding rock as well, but it's quite soft rock, so that's not too difficult to do. So how far back do sipunculan borings go? And we now have fossils from the Castlebank biota and in the Ordovician, and also there are some which are supposedly sipunculans from the Chengjiang biota. Personally, I think they're quite convincing. I know others are less certain. But that would be back in the early Cambrian. So this is a modern subgroup of the annelid worms, the segmented worms nowadays. It used to be its own phylum, but the sipunculans are now a part of that larger group. And there are borings attributed to sipunculans going back a long way. However, most of these borings are actually vertical ones into solid surfaces, like limestones. You can hopefully see that the shape of these borings, which are called tripanites, is actually extremely similar to what we have in this horizontal borings on the surface of the Nautiloid shell. They have a wide end, which is furthest from the surface, and then the narrow end is where the other part of the worm sticks out. This does mean that it's actually a bit of a squeeze for them to get out of them, but they don't need to escape these borings because they're mostly suspension feeders. They have a tentacled proboscis which they can project up into the water, catch lots of fine particles and suck it back in again. So being embedded in rock like that is actually a really useful trick. Aside from anything else, it means it's much harder for predators to catch them. In case you're wondering how they do this, it's a combination of secreting an acidic substance which weakens the rock and then scratching away at the surface of the rock with the hooks and the spines that cover their quite tough cuticle. So the combination actually allows them to etch into particularly rocks that are prone to dissolution like limestones. And they appear to have been doing this for a long, long time. So these borings go back to the Ordovician at least, and probably also the Cambrian. There are similar ones in the Cambrian. It's often very difficult to know what exactly has made a trace fossil like a boring. So a lot of these vertical ones in the Cambrian, which are very simple, we don't know for certain that they were made by sipunculans. But by the Ordovician there are much more characteristic shaped ones with these widening downwards, and by then they're not only vertical borings into solid structures. There are rare examples, including from the early Ordovician, of more sort of flat borings around the surfaces of shells, in this case brachiopods, where they're exploiting a very thin layer rather than a massive surface. You're probably thinking by now, hang on, he promised me something new. Well, that's where it starts to get interesting, because there aren't that many examples of the tripanites borings actually within the surface of a shell. And in nautiloids, it's even rarer. In fact, there's only a couple of occurrences in the literature that I could find with a fairly quick search, but I had a good look, of ones which were suspected to be tripanites borings, sipunculan borings, into the shell of a nautiloid. Which is quite surprising, because nautiloid shells can be quite thick and they sort of sit on the seafloor and provide a nice solid surface, but there aren't many of them known. But what's interesting about this particular specimen is that when you look at the distribution of them, I mentioned before that there is a band of borings going across the surface, and you can just about make it out here when the shadows are right, that there is a band going across the middle of the shell, and then there is another band just near the edge which is also going across the shell. Perhaps most importantly, these aren't just arranged in bands going across the shell, but they are aligned within them. They're all going lengthways to the shell. This is really, really interesting, because if you imagine a dead nautiloid shell sitting on the seafloor waiting for things to colonise it, there's no obvious reason why they should be in bands going across it. Okay, maybe it was colour banded or something like that, and there were some bands that were more tasty than others, but we're getting a bit speculative. But even if that was the case, there is certainly no reason why they should be aligned to the length of the nautiloid. However, it does all fit together if we assume that the nautiloid was still alive and swimming at the time. Because these are filter-feeding worms, suspension feeders. They like a flow of water over them so that they don't have to work so hard to catch their food. The food gets drawn to them. So if you were to align yourself near the mouth end of the nautiloid shell, near the front end, then you have a constant flow of water coming towards you as the nautiloid moves, and you want to be aligned with the current. What this seems to be showing us is a nautiloid that was severely infested, while it was still alive, by these little suspension-feeding worms that attached themselves to its shell, en masse, presumably a mass spawning event. They attached themselves and started boring near to the mouth end to make the best use of the current. And this happened at least twice. There were 2 mass spatfall events of these worms with the larvae settling on the shell, finding the best place, and then starting their little borings. And these would have been etching into the shell of the nautiloid, which, if it started to weaken it too much, would start to be quite a big problem. Presumably it didn't, because the shell is mostly intact, and, well, we've only got a small piece of it, but we assume the rest of it was mostly intact. But ultimately, a real infestation like that could cause a lot of damage to the shell and potentially lead to it collapsing. Which is interesting. All these things that nautiloids have to put up with that we never thought about. And that is what appears to be new for this specimen. That we've got new knowledge about the trials and tribulations of poor little Silurian nautiloids living in the Welsh Basin. And we didn't know until now that these things were actually attacking the nautiloid shells while they were still alive. We didn't even know for certain that these sipunculans were boring into these Paleozoic nautiloids at all. So it's not a huge story in the grand scheme of things, but it's just a little bit more information that we didn't have before. And this was not a very important fossil site by any means. It's a random quarry in the Welsh borders, and it looks like pretty much any other random quarry from this sort of time period. And it's only by keeping your eyes open, looking for things that are unusual, things that strike you as not being quite normal, that you can start to tease out these little stories like this, start to bring these dead stones to life. And that is really what paleontology is about. It's not about finding that perfect specimen that looks really good on the mantelpiece. It's about digging out stories about what life was really like in these ancient times, long, long before anything that's familiar to us. It's amazing that we can do it at all, really. There may even be yet another layer to this story, because if when you look even closer, that surface is covered with little ridges and lines, often picked out by sort of red iron oxide material. And these may be nothing. It might just be some sort of effect of fracturing of the shell as it's being compressed. But some of them look like they're actually etched into it, like the borings are. So I might come back to that one day, but for the moment, this is as far as we've got, and that's quite enough. It's a nice little addition to the sum of human knowledge from a random rock, from a random quarry in the middle of nowhere. So the big question is, what are you waiting for? Off you go. Go and find something else, and then tell me about it, or else.